the story starts here really, back in the beginning of the 19th century. And a chap called Richard Polwhele, who was the vicar of Menachen at the time, he'd have driven through Menachen, he recorded a tunnel somewhere in the parish of St Anthony near Boden Fogou. Now Boden Fogou is the little farmhouse just on the down at the bottom of the hill below us. And because of that historic record, when the parish checklist was being prepared, which was the forerunner of the historic environment record, the people putting that together spotted that little reference and thought, well, there's been a tunnel recorded somewhere up on this hillside. Perhaps it's a Fogou, because he records a tunnel, and you know that's not usual unless it's related to mining. We're not in a mining area, so they put a little dot somewhere up here. And apart from that, that's all we knew about any potential archaeology in this field. And then we roll forward all the way to 1991, when Chris Hoskin, who's the farmer of this landowner, he was putting in a water pipe, which is just over there. At your leisure, you could have a look at that hole. There's a little panel next to it. But that's where, when he was putting in the pipe, he discovered a bit of a pit in the ground. And from that pit, he started pulling bits of pottery, bits of broken worked stone. He took those to colleagues of mine at Cornwall Archaeological Unit, and they said, well, this is fascinating because this pottery dates to the Romano-British period, and the stone looks like it's small pieces of broken quernstone, grinding stone for producing flour from wheat and other cereals. Of course, they then cross-referenced that with this historic record of Richard Polwhele's findings somewhere up here, and thought, well, that's fascinating. Now we've got some real archaeological evidence, possibly associated with what Richard Polwhele saw, which could be some kind of Fogou. On the back of that, we persuaded Historic England to fund some geophysical survey of this field and surrounding fields, and what they came up with, using a variety of techniques. Bearing in mind this is over 30 years ago now, so geophysics was not quite in its infancy, but not as developed as it is today. But despite that, they came up with a range of features in this field, which looked like it was a series of ditches and pits and curvilinear enclosures and things like that we normally associate with some sort of prehistoric settlement site. In this area, the archaeology or the anomalies that were showing up on the geophysics was poorly defined, to say the least. But it sat within what we recognised as what looked like a large ditched enclosure. Now, in the from the late prehistoric period into the Roman period and just beyond, we see a lot of enclosed sites in Cornwall that, of course, we traditionally refer to as rounds. Although a lot of rounds aren't round at all; they're square or they're rectangular or they're some other kind of wiggly shape. And the round we've got here is a kind of trapezoid. It's got two long sides and one end shorter than the other. And what you're looking at in front of us here is the ditch, the excavated ditch of this enclosure. So if, for instance, you were to go up to Castle Andinus and you've got one of those large ditches in front of a rampart, and you were to excavate it down to its bedrock base, this is what you would see, something very similar. So we've got this very sharp V-shaped ditch, and we know from the geophysics and from excavated evidence that it runs out into the field in front of us about 20 yards, 30 yards. It turns at the right angled corner. It runs through where the cars are parked to the kink in the hedge, just beyond that white van. And then alongside the lower hedge, just this side, into the next field, into Lower Way Field, which is that one, up the other side of this hedge in front of us, and then returns here. The geophysics doesn't show any kind of entrance into this site. It doesn't mean it doesn't have one, it's just we haven't seen it yet. It's possible, of course, that the modern entrance into the field in that bottom corner is the prehistoric entrance. Of course, ditches like this produce large amounts of material, quarried material, and usually they form the ramparts or banks on the interior of late prehistoric enclosures, rounds. And we can assume that there would have been the same here prior to everything being backfilled and ploughed flat and everything else. Putting hill forts to one side for the moment and focusing more on the smaller enclosed sites, the rounds, we would always expect the banks, the ramparts, to be on the inside of the ditches. So we can expect here, the other side of this big open ditch, to have a large bank in front of us, helping to enclose the site. Where the modern hedges, which is probably part of the hedge system laid out in the 18th century, along with the others here, it's quite likely that that hedge was laid along the remnant of the original prehistoric bank. But all the others appear to have gone. Now, one day, perhaps, if Chris, who's an incredibly patient man, is keen for us to investigate that, we could put a slot, we could excavate a slot through that modern hedge and perhaps find a remnant of the original prehistoric bank lying below that. Now, you could ask me, well, how do we know this is prehistoric? Well, we've excavated it in several places, here in front of us, and in two other locations, which we did back in 2003, which was when English Heritage at the time gave us some funding to investigate these geophysical survey features. And from that, we retrieved quite a lot of pottery, which we radiocarbon dated from burnt residues to around about 400 or 300 BC. So merging from the middle into the late Iron Age, really. And alongside that, we started investigating the other features, both inside the enclosed site and outside. And that's when we started discovering parts of the buried Fogou, confirming what Richard Polwheel had pointed out all those years before. I should say, really, that the interest was piqued here again in 1996, when Chris again was putting some sand in the field, and a big hole opened up underneath his tractor wheel, which is where the remnant of the hole is, where we've opened it up there, where that little white tag is. And he had basically discovered a void under his tractor wheel. A few years later, he called me out, and I climbed down into that hole, and under the ground about 4 meters in length, where it was blocked at the end, close to where that scaffolding is. Subsequent to our work then in whenever that was, 2003, we carried on working here. We'd had a lot of support from local volunteers, and we formed the Meneage Archaeology Group. So although that original work was carried out by Cornwall Archaeological Unit, part of a commercial contract paid for by English Heritage, we then carried on. People didn't want to leave the site. They were too enthused, really, wanted to keep coming back. And we realised we had a lot more to look at here. So we built up this band of volunteers. We've now got something like 75 members, perhaps 20 of whom come out regularly through the summer to excavate. We dig every Friday and Saturday. And over the years, since 2008, when we formally got together, we've slowly started exploring more of the geophysical surveys, more of the Fogou site, and some very interesting features on the other side of the field. Now, as well as the Iron Age enclosure ditch and Iron Age Fogou, the pottery from the Fogou confirmed that it was the same sort of date as the ditch here, around about 400 BC. As well as that, we looked at features just outside the enclosure ditch, about 30 yards out in the field behind me, where we had a subcircular anomaly showing up in the geophysics that looked particularly interesting. That's where the magnetometer had discovered an area of disturbed ground. And typically, where we've seen those in other places, it suggests a hollow buried under the ground that's been filled in some way with the ground disturbed. We excavated a part of that, and what we revealed was the edge of a sunken featured Bronze Age roundhouse. So in the lowland areas of Cornwall, off the moor, you'd expect roundhouses from the middle of the Bronze Age, around about 1500 BC to about 1200 BC, to be dug into hollows of the ground with a perimeter of vertical posts supporting a thatched roof. And we caught just a little bit of that. It's now all backfilled. You might be able to make out there's a slightly darker patch of grass in a bit of a hollow over there. That's where that was sited. What we recognised as we were excavating the site was that in the floor of the roundhouse were laid some very large sherds of Middle Bronze Age pottery in a style known as Treviska ware, which is typical decorated pottery from the Middle Bronze Age. And it's characterised by geometric lines and chevrons, often created by impressing twisted cord, and I'll show you some of that in a moment. So we knew we had an Iron Age site here, which looked particularly interesting, including confirming the presence of a fogou, albeit without a roof. And the fogou, and we'll be able to see more of it as we walk around the fence, the fogou consists of stone-walled passageway, similar to Carnuni. I'm sure you've all been there. Similar in some ways to Hiligi on the Trellewarren estate, just down the road here. So we've got an enclosed site, a fogou, and preceding that by about 1,000 years, we've got a very nice Bronze Age roundhouse. We returned in 2008 in collaboration with Cornwall Archaeological Society, and we excavated the rest of that roundhouse. I'm currently still working on the post-excavation archive for that to get it published. And the initial results of all our work was published in volume 52 of the Cornwall Archaeological Society Journal, if you want to look that out. So we returned in 2008, we excavated the rest of the roundhouse, we excavated more of the fogou. We found that we've got an entrance area somewhere within the enclosure, which is over near where that scaffolding is, just to its left. That enters into a stone-walled passageway on a north-south alignment. It turns very sharply, runs along where you can see the excavation in front of us to that area of scaffolding. It steps deep down into the ground there, at which point it becomes a tunnel cut through the shillet here. Now that's interesting because what Pol Wheel originally recorded back at the beginning of the 19th century was, he said, and there's a quote here, he said that it was merely an excavation of the earth without any stones for walls or roof, which doesn't sound, of course, like many of our fogous. But if you were to go to, say, Pendine Vow, for instance, or Belay, you'll see that parts of those fogous have got earth-cut sections running away from the stone tunnels. And he was, of course, probably comparing the site to perhaps Piskis Hall near Constantine, or to Hiligi, which would have been recently explored by the antiquarians at the time. So he had something to go on, but he wasn't sure really what this was. So yeah, we've explored quite a lot, most of the architecture, if you want to term it that, of this fogou. What's interesting at this end, as we enter out of the earth-cut tunnel, one that Pol Wheel probably saw, is that we've got a small stone-walled and capped chamber. You can see that in front of us. Those of you who are intrepid enough to come up to the rope will be able to see it. And this acts as a little creep passage, if you want to call it that, connecting the main fogou passageway with what would have been the open enclosure ditch surrounding it. Now, this is something we see at other fogous. When Bill Startin excavated Hiligi in 1982, he recognised a very similar feature. If you go into Hiligi now, that's now blocked with concrete and the enclosure ditch is backfilled. But you walk over effectively what was the enclosure ditch as you enter the site. And of course, those fogous associated with courtyard house settlements, such as Carnuni, also enter between sections of the settlement. So we'll walk around the fogou heading that direction, and on the way, first, before we do that, I'll just show off a little bit of this pottery. This is Treviska ware, so this was first identified at the site of Treviska, a the first roundhouse really that was excavated that we recognised being of this type. Not sure when Treviska was excavated. I think it was in the 50s. And lots of this pottery was recognised there. You can see this section, this sherd here is pretty chunky. And this is one of these very large vessels that we identified in the roundhouse. Some of it is finer. There's a nice rim sherd, but with similar decoration on it. Cord impressed lines and chevrons. And again, some nice cord impressed sherds there. This is particularly nice. Amazing. Several sherds that clearly belong together. There's the part of the rim, and we've got a geometric incised pattern with a nice finger impressed dimple going along there. It's a bit smaller than my chubby fingers, but that makes a really lovely pattern. Another one with a fingernail decoration going around it, which you can see there with, again, some incised lines. We've had an enormous amount of that material. All of that I've just showed you belongs to this Middle Bronze Age period, around about 1400 BC. In addition, we've got very large sherds of early Romano-British material. This is something called cordoned ware. And we've had, this all came from part of the Fogou, from an area around its entrance area, which we think was the latest part of the Fogou used, well after its construction in the Iron Age. And then also some fragments of some that's part of an Iron Age flanged bowl, so late Iron Age material there. We've had a massive range, including, and I haven't got it to hand, but we've even had fragments of Neolithic stone axe that have found their way into the backfill of our Middle Bronze Age roundhouse at a later period when it's effectively being used as a midden. And that's quite interesting because it seems to be that the pattern's been emerging for the last 20 years of us excavating similar sites, that Bronze Age roundhouses, when they're abandoned, or appear to be abandoned in a very structured, perhaps even ritualised way. And there's some sort of ceremonial event, perhaps, of material being put into them, and the sites becoming effectively markers in the landscape, territorial markers relating to a particular community. And we see that more and more. At least that's one interpretation of why people might be depositing particularly nice their nice material possessions inside their roundhouse, or even material they've broken over the generations and bringing it back in. What we don't find around these sites is separate middened areas, so they're all using their houses effectively to bring the material back in. We can talk about the Iron Age pottery more in a minute as we walk around the outside of the roundhouse. As we're walking this way, please avoid this big steel plate here, which is a bit of a trip hazard. So here you can see we're now at the southern end of the Fogou, this Fogou complex, and so you're stood within our enclosed site here. So you can imagine from where that white van is and that blue car is, imagine this rampart in front of us with a ditch to the other side that ran up and then turned and enclosed this Fogou site. Its rampart probably covered the entire passageway that you can see that turns sharply beyond our entranceway there. Now, you'll know at Carnuni and Haligi, those sites have passageways covered with large stone lintels. And we suspect strongly that this site was covered in a similar way, but that the stones were robbed away, and they probably exist in local gateposts and in as grounders in hedges and people's houses and everything else. Now, we found one lintel stone that had fallen into the passageway, we think, when the roof was being robbed. And it was situated quite close to where we've replaced it, over that doorway there. We call it a doorway. There's no evidence that there's a door, but it's where the passageway narrows. You can see that quite clearly. And to the left and to the right, underneath the stone lintel, you can see two rather lovely looking white stone quartzite blocks, which support 3 blocks either side that are slightly corbelled in, reducing the width of the passageway as it rises towards its roof.
And that was there, you haven't reconstructed?
No, we have. We've placed it back. So we found that stone lying on the floor of the Fogou. My suspicion is that when the other stones were all being robbed, when the roof stones were being robbed away, one of them fell in. And of course, it's quite a lot of effort to lift a block like that out. That stone weighs over a ton, and we lifted it with a large machine. What's interesting about the stone itself is most of the stone making up the Fogou, if you look at it, you can see it's rather lovely. It's got greys and purples and whites, and it's a metamorphic rock with a strong quartz component, but it's all been imported into this field, so none of it exists geologically in this landscape. The closest source for this would be the valley below where you'd have taken the unmarked lane after Meneage. So it's come, I don't know, 1/4 of a mile, something like that, 1/2 a mile. But the large block making up that lintel where we've replaced it, and 1 or 2 other pieces, they're made of gabbroic rock. Now the nearest source of gabbro is Crowser Downs, which is 2 miles to the south of us, or is it 2 kilometres? I can never remember. But it's that way, and it's between, if any of you know the main road between Helston and St Kevin, it's the area to the south of that before you get to Coverack and Lowland Point. And there's an area of the downs there where gabbroic rock, which is a type of igneous rock, comes to the surface. When it degrades, it turns into a clay, which is gabbroic clay. And what's special about gabbroic clay is it makes up more than 95% of all the pottery so far that we've discovered that we find anywhere in Cornwall between the Neolithic period, when we start making pottery in Cornwall, all the way up into the post-Roman period. At times mixed with other local clays, but almost exclusively using gabbroic clay from an area that is about 2 miles in diameter on the east coast of the Lizard. Now, we don't know why everybody only wanted to use gabbroic clay, but we got to assume it either had some sort of special property, or the location from which it was from had some kind of special status. But it's interesting that all the pottery found on this site, apart from things imported from the Mediterranean, for instance, they're all made of gabbroic clay, and 1 or 2 elements in the Fogou, including our only surviving lintel stone, are made of gabbro rock. So a quick mention about other things we've found in the Fogou. We have got a side passage which runs underneath through where that scaffold support is, and we know from some work we did with Time Team a couple of years ago, it appears to connect, it's part of a feature, a tunnel that appears to connect with the enclosure ditch out in the field about 30 yards in that direction, close to the corner of our enclosure. And we hope at some point in the future to explore that in detail. Currently, we go just to round about where the fence is over there, and it goes about 4 metres down into the ground, cut into the natural bedrock. You can see the pick marks that have been made by picking away this stone, and we suspect it's part of the original Fogou construction, or possibly a later phase. From that, we've had some late Iron Age pottery, something called Southwest decorated ware, fragments of a shale bracelet or a shale ring. There's this board here, has a little photo of it, and that's imported from Dorset. Alongside that material, and in other features that we found within our enclosure, a lot of this remains unexplored. We've also had material that's come from as far afield as Western Turkey, so what would have been Focia in the 4th century AD, and Roman amphory fragments made on the banks of the Guadalquivir River in Andalusia in southern Spain. So we're in an area of contact with the wider world, if you like, even though we're part of a very local, traditional Cornish community living here in the Iron Age periods and the centuries either side, and back in the Bronze Age, of course. But if we go over there to the other side, we can talk more about the other stuff we found and those wider contacts. So follow me and we'll reconvene over there. Now we're jumping around a bit chronologically here, but what you can see in front of you is the ongoing excavation of a Middle Bronze Age roundhouse. So I talked earlier, didn't I, about the sunken featured nature of these, and we've seen these and excavated them through my work at CAU. We've excavated these, say, extensively in Newquay, Carnan Gate, elsewhere on the Lizard, down near Sennen, and all over really, Scarcewater and Clay Country, and this it's not looking particularly pretty, but this shallow scoop in the ground in front of you is what survives of one of these Middle Bronze Age roundhouses. So material I'm stood on here, this is effectively the natural bedrock. It's not very nice bedrock at surface, it's very weathered, but this is what we dig down to because we know that this material is untouched by human hands. So anything dug into this, anything dug into the geology must represent where people have been before us. So when we came down to this material and started cleaning back, we started here with a series of linear trenches because I was trying to look for some geophysical anomalies that I saw that when we'd had some refreshed geophysics done by the time team, I thought here we were going to find some strange curving ditches. I didn't find that at all. I found another one of these roundhouses. But we go down to the natural geology there and then we start cleaning off. And of course, because this hollow was filled with the soils that are generated from abandonment and vegetation and domestic refuse and everything else, it was filled with a darker soil that showed up very clearly against the natural subsoil that you can see there. Now, it's terrible light for this sort of work, but you might be able to see that left in what we call our section. So this is a bulk section. It effectively gives me a control through the hollow, and you can see the different layers of soil makeup. There's one down here, which is quite dark. Then there's a little light, there's a lighter band in there, slightly darker one again, and then we're in the topsoil. And this is what we recognise as we excavate down. And from these layers, we've had probably 200 sherds of pottery of Middle Bronze Age Treviscoware that have come out of those layers, sitting above what's effectively was the floor of the roundhouse. Now, you might ask, why would anybody choose to live on a surface like this? It can't have been very comfortable. It probably wasn't. And that's what they would have used is probably beaten earth, straw, cob type material. And we've got evidence from other sites, and for instance, our roundhouse that we excavated previously, we've got some preserved clay floor that had survived because of the rakings out of the hearth, the central hearth, that effectively fired the clay, so it survived. Ordinarily, we don't have any evidence of those earth floors because they just end up merging with everything else above them through the centuries, in fact millennia of water percolating through the site. But into the bottom into the bottom of the cut, as we call it, the scoop in the ground, we then expect to see features like post holes and pits that would have been required as part of the structure of the building. And typically we get post holes, in other words, holes dug into the ground into which the vertical posts would have been placed around the periphery of the cut. I've got to be careful not to trip over any of these strings and make a fool of myself. And you can see one in front of us here, and a range of them starting to show up around the edge of the cut there. And you'll have to take my word for it, but just the other side of this bulk here, we're starting to find what looks like our central hearth, just off centre in fact, which looks like it's been deliberately backfilled on abandonment with nice stones, some of which were probably used in the cooking process. They've been heated up and used to boil water or to bury with joints of meat to cook them. And we found a very similar feature when we looked at our roundhouse over there. Being mindful of time, better move on to what we've got over here. We've effectively removed all the soil above this site, including everything in the buried features, the archaeological features, down to the natural geology. We've excavated, we've recorded, we've retrieved the finds, we've made notes of those, we've taken exhaustive photographs and drawings, the sorts of things we need to do in order to record these sites. But what's particularly interesting about everything from the Bronze Age roundhouse, remember that roundhouse was lived in around about 1400 BC. Everything to the south of that, from this big hole here down to where we've excavated, dates to the first few centuries AD, into the Roman period. At one end we've got the remains of a shallow oval hollow in the ground, ringed by stone. You can't see it very clearly. It's at the far end of the site. But what was so interesting about that was there was a pit excavated in the entrance into that space. We don't know whether it's the remnant of a house or not, but it was an oval space similar to the oval construction of Romano-British roundhouses in Cornwall. But in the pit, we retrieved a very large sherd of Roman Samian ware. So for the initiated amongst you, Samian ware is effectively fine tableware from the Roman period, and not the Roman period in Cornwall traditionally, but the Roman period in the Romanized world. So the Roman parts of Britain, Exeter and eastwards, effectively, or from Roman Gaul or from beyond. Now, what's special about that bit of Samian ware is we can tell where it was made, when it was made, and who made it, because Samian ware is incredibly well studied. And it was made in central France, Gaul at the time, near the town of Vichy, between the years of 160 and 195 AD, by a man called Patronus II. It's got figures in relief on the pot. Samian ware bowls are made in by pressing clay into moulds, and the moulds were traded. So you see the same motifs occurring again and again. And what's special about this one is that it's the most richly decorated sherd of Samian ware ever found in Cornwall, and it's the largest sherd of Samian ware ever found in Cornwall. If you'd like to see it, it's currently in Helston Museum on display there. And there are three figurative motifs marked on the pot. One of them is a woman dancing with a veil, a fairly standard motif in Roman Samian ware production. And then there's the god Pan standing on a severed head, playing a pipe, again quite common. And then next to them, there's a adult Roman couple engaged in an adult pursuit, which again is a fairly common motif in Roman Samian ware pottery. But what's not common is finding something like that in this kind of context, in this otherwise very Cornish community, which probably moved on from the Iron Age without too much interaction with the wider Roman world. There clearly was some interaction with the wider Roman world. We don't understand the dynamics of that quite, But we do know, of course, that the Helford River nearby us here was a major communication river which afforded access into the Lizard. You've only got a short hop the other side of Gweek and you can get into Mounts Bay, and also to the tin bearing grounds to the north of that in the Wendron district. We're not in tin bearing grounds here. So we had that Samian ware. In the centre of the site you can see a pit lined with stone, and surrounding that we've got curvilinear, what were these curving gullies. From that pit we retrieved some Roman coins, probably about 30, and Roman hobnails. That's interesting in itself, alongside some other material that was made locally, some of this Gabroic ware. And then here we've got another very big pit. It's about 4 feet deep. It's about 6 feet long. It's got vertical sides and a flat base. Now, from that we recovered material, lots of pottery, burnt wood that's surviving in the form of charcoal, and about 650 Roman coins. Now the Roman coins from that pit and that pit date to the second half of the 3rd century AD, from about 250 onwards, mainly after about 275, during a period of the when the Roman Empire was split up into the different provinces, and we're effectively part of the Celtic province here until it's reunified. And you get a lot of emperors during that period of the 3rd century. They change every few months effectively, and that's reflected in some of the coins we've got. They're currently all at the British Museum being conserved, and they're part of a treasure case, of course, because they're a large hoard of coins. Also from that pit we had lots of hobnails. Now hobnails are not something traditionally used by the traditional Cornish communities here. They're again an intervention or an invention of the Roman world, and specifically hobnails occur in graves. Hobnails, not necessarily coins, but hobnails commonly found in graves because shoes and boots and sandals were placed with the dead in order to give passage into the next world. We're working on the assumption that our 2 pits here are graves from the Roman period, but we don't have any bone. So you could suggest that's a bit of a leap, but of course these are very acid soils and bone doesn't preserve. You've only got to go back to the early medieval period and you'd be very lucky to find any bone preserved at all. I excavated a kissed grave from inside Sydney Church about 10 miles away, and that's dated to around about 700 AD, and there the bone is incredibly fragmentary. So take it back another few hundred years and it's probably a reason why none of the bones survives. We're currently working through soil samples which we sieve. We use a thing called flotation, so we put the soil, we effectively float any of the organic remains through water and push them through a fine sieve in the hope that we might find a tooth or a fragment of bone which can be identified as human and put an end to any speculation that we've got a grave site here. And really to wrap up, probably, I think what's important is that there's some sort of relationship here with the local community in the Romano British period and the wider Roman world, which we don't fully understand. But imagine the classical figure representations on the Samian ware pottery and how alien that would have felt to the local community here that would never have seen that representation of the human form in any other way than by looking at each other or by looking at their faces in the mirror glass of a pond or something like that. It would have been the first time they'd ever seen anything like that. And there's evidence from the pot that it was traced by the fingers and probably curated for a long period of time, which is something common amongst Samian ware anyway. These were probably treasured heirlooms passed down through the generations. So it could be, of course, that by the time the pot found its way in the ground, the pot made around about 160 to 190 AD, the coins going in the ground at some point after 260-ish AD, so 100 years later, that the pot may have been passed down through the generations and finally ended up in the ground, perhaps very deliberately buried, at the same time that this site was being used for what's clearly not standard domestic practice. We haven't found the Roman houses here. We've found something else that we don't fully understand yet, but we think might be linked to burial. There are other features surrounding our graves, little pits full of pottery mounded over with little stones. We've now excavated them all. You can see these pits in front of me. And I suggest these might have been sites where people were coming to pay their respects to the dead, their family members buried in these graves, and perhaps feasting at the time, something like that. Whether these were travellers from a distant land coming to us from the Romanised parts of Britain and bringing their material with them, or whether they were members of the local community that had travelled further afield and brought material back, we will never really know. But it's clear that this material was very special to them. And I suspect somewhere there's the remains of our Samian bowl. We've got about a quarter of it. So another 3/4 perhaps are split up between family members who loved Granny's Samian bowl and loved the pictures on them, and they're buried in other sacred places nearby. Maybe we'll find them one day, maybe we won't.
Did they do that? Did they use to split bowls up?
Yes, yeah. And I think, we see that even occurring in the Bronze Age with the highly decorated material. There's evidence from our, slightly speculative evidence, but it's one interpretation, that our Bronze Age material, the very large vessels, very highly decorated, in the roundhouse we excavated in 2008, had been laid down on the floor and then walked on, or even jumped on, or even danced on. It's clear from the way they were laid out that it isn't a collapsed bowl that's been just dropped and it's fragmented, because there's a disproportionate amount of it face up with its decoration showing, and then the site's been deliberately backfilled. So Belinda told me to wrap up by 10:02-ish. I'm 5 minutes late, but that gives us time for any questions you might have, probably before 3 o'clock.
I'm wondering why there should be a grave site here in Roman times. Was that bit occupied at the same time?
Yeah, well,
All inside the ditch?
of course, there's a lot I haven't said, because I can go on for about 5 hours. But there's some interesting elements to talk about, really. We've discovered in the next field to the north of us, beyond the brow of this hill, in the next field, we've got a square enclosure. It's about 25 metres square. We've excavated part of it, and it's a V-shaped ditch surrounding a square interior space, inside which there isn't a lot but big post holes. From that site, you get an amazing view, particularly if you took away the modern hedgerows, of the whole of Carrick Roads and Falmouth Bay over to the Roseland. Aerial mapping specialists have started to see similar sites dotted around the Cornish coast, which are being interpreted as potential Roman signal stations. And we now know, of course, take it back a few years, and in fact even today, if you're at school in Cornwall, you'll be told that the Romans didn't come to Cornwall. That pattern is starting to change. You've probably heard something about that. We've had our recent discoveries at Roach with a marching camp and a fortlet. We've got forts at Calstock, okay, only just in Cornwall. Nanstallen, where previous to our Samian ware, there was the site where the most Samian ware had been found, Nanstallen Roman fort. Restormal, there's next to Restormal Castle, there's a major Roman fort there, showing in the geophysics. It's clearly a Roman fort. All of those sites sit on positions that look over the river valleys. Here we've got a site, we haven't got a fort, but perhaps we've got a Roman signal station, very close to the Helford River and Gillen Creek, which are these communication routes, and these clear views over to both the Roseland and looking west over to the Granite Ridge through the Wendron district, effectively the road from Helston to Falmouth, and beyond to Goonhilly, where we may have other similar sites. And from those, from Goonhilly, you see down to West Penwith and across Mounts Bay. So maybe there's a connection there. We don't really know yet. We'll probably in the future look at more of our suspected Roman site and see whether we can throw any more interpretation at that. It's important. One final thing is on the same lines, really. What's interesting is that ordinarily, and in my day-to-day work with CAU, we might see sites, these multi-phase prehistoric and Roman sites, all intercutting each other, because of course this site here lived in around about 1400 BC. We haven't done any radiocarbon dates yet, but judging by the pottery, maybe as late as 1200 BC, something like that. And then this feature here, this grave potentially, and the rest of these features here, all in use around about 250 AD. Now that's a big period of time in between. But if we consider these roundhouses as being abandoned and left in the landscape as deliberate markers of a community at the time, it might be why that slightly Romanized community, when they came to bury their dead, stopped here. What we haven't got in our Bronze Age roundhouse is any evidence of any intercutting of these later periods. So all Roman activity stops here. Could it be, I think it's perhaps it's a bit of a stretch of the imagination that there might have been some kind of folkloric presence of a site here, but if it was mounded over like a mini barrow, then perhaps it held a kind of significance through the generations that was passed down to the people coming here in the early centuries AD. Of course, the people living here and abandoning this house back in the Bronze Age only had to look into the landscape around them, Ross Scrooge Beacon on the hill to the south of us, and to a myriad of these on the Goonhilly to see the Bronze Age barrows, the burial places of their ancestors, probably buried around about 500 years before these people lived here. So are lowland roundhouses, as we would call them here, are they emulating barrows because they know it's a way of impressing their physical ownership on the landscape around them? Yes. Oh yeah, we didn't cover that, did we? We didn't cover that. That's rather important. So there are three main mooted functions, explanations. Okay, you've probably all heard them. Okay, somewhere to hide in, somewhere to store stuff in, and somewhere to worship in. So if we cover the first one, somewhere to hide in. Well, the last place I would want to go during a raid by some angry locals is in a hole in the ground, particularly if they knew I was there. You can be blocked in, you can be smoked out, you can be besieged, all of those things. If you imagine running through that convoluted passage and then trying to climb through the little creek passage at the end, only to emerge into a V-shaped ditch with a big rampart one side of you, with no means of escape, I don't buy it. If we look at storage, experiments show that unlike, say, on the Thames gravels, where we know that people of that period in the Iron Age were successfully storing grain in the ground in the free draining gravels for use through the winter for livestock and into the next season. Experiments show that even back then, and the climate hasn't changed too much, that Fogous would be an unsuitable place for such storage. They would probably be suitable for cheese and other dairy produce. However, their their physical layout doesn't lend itself to handy storage, whereas say the hulls from the 17th century onwards associated with houses, effectively, underground cold storage places, they're built underground. They have shelving areas, they have little side rooms, they're all nice and square, and they're all very practical spaces. So I think personally, can't prove it, but I think Fogous are connected with a lost religion or a means of worship from the prehistoric period. I recommend anybody to go to Heligi nearby, to walk to the end of the longest passage there, to climb into the stone cut chamber right at the end and turn your torch off. Give it 5 minutes and I think you'll probably have a bit of a religious experience. So give it a go. So that's what I think Fogous are for.
Is it possible, because I'm quite interested in the early tin industry, could they have actually stored something like tin in there?
Well, again, yeah, it's possible. Of course, we've never found much in Fogous, but then if you were using them to store a precious commodity, you're not going to find them, and presumably they move on somewhere else, unless there's some catastrophic collapse or something like that. But what puts me off that idea again, the storage of anything, any commodity, whether it's really precious or not, is that they don't appear to be very practical spaces for the storage. You could argue, say, perhaps at Carnuni, where you've got a nice circular chamber associated with it, and of course that's clearly a multi-phased Fogou. Patricia Christie's work recognised that that's built over the periods, and in fact the Cornwall chamber, I think, relates to the Courtyard House period, and it's quite likely that that at that point it's being associated with tin trade in West Penwith. Then yeah, maybe. What we need to find is a collapsed Fogou full of tin ingots, and then that would prove it. Yes.
You talked about the time team.
Yeah.
Would that, if you went on?
Yeah, you can find, well, the time team weekend that occurred here was the first of their relaunched online presence, and it was broadcast in 2022, I think. And you can go on YouTube. So in YouTube, or even just into Google or other search engines, and just type Boden Time Team, and you'll find the full episode. And that was the work we did over 3 days with them, in the standard sort of time team format, really. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you. Thanks for coming. Lovely day.
Thank you ever so much, Jane. That was very informative.
Hey, hope everybody enjoyed it.